We're excited to announce Apex Agents, our benchmark for measuring how well agents can do economically valuable tasks. Also super excited to have the team behind it with us today, specifically Abby, Oz, and Birdie. And maybe to start it off, we can kick off with a question that's on all of our minds, which is, what is Apex Agents and why does it matter?
So we care a lot about benchmarking at Mercor, and when surveying the landscape of benchmarks that exist today, we saw a big gap in benchmarks that measure how well can an agent do someone's actual job in the same environment that they're doing it. In the real world, I'm doing stuff in Google Workspace all the time, or Microsoft Productivity Suite, depending on the company I'm at, and I'm usually interacting with sheets and slides and docs. I've got information all over the place, and I need to look at all of these different places where I have different files, and I need to do some kind of knowledge work across all of them, and then make some kind of output that I give to my boss. That core flow is something we want to emulate in Apex Agents, and we want to do it for the top of the market. We want to do it for lawyers, for bankers, for consultants. And it was a huge push in both the complexity of the data that we have in benchmarks and the sim to real gap getting smaller and smaller between what's in the benchmark and what people actually do in their jobs.
So earlier you mentioned Mercor is really focused on benchmarks. Maybe you could share a little bit of context about why we're so passionate about benchmarks and how you see Apex Agents as a differentiated benchmark compared to the palette of offerings today.
We care a lot about benchmarks because they're what drive model improvement. Every day, every night, you have thousands of researchers at Frontier Labs obsessing over how do they make these numbers go up on a few key benchmarks. And all of their work is abstracted away into a few numbers here. And if that benchmark, if that goalpost is on something that's not useful for people, like it's measuring how well can you solve some puzzle or do something like that, it could be measuring some core capability of a model, but it's not measuring the impact it'll have on the world. We want to make sure that we can iterate very, very quickly on what's being measured by Frontier Labs so that any model improvement, all that hard work and sweat and billions of dollars is going towards making models useful in people's day-to-day lives. And we tie that to the specific person that's represented in the benchmark. So all of these people do different jobs. So we're trying to systematically cover the work that's done so that we focus the efforts of labs towards useful work.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that's super interesting about Apex Agents is that the tasks are both super hard, but they're also really representative real world work. So Abby, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what do these tasks look like, what domains do they cover, and what do the experts actually do?
We worked with top experts with backgrounds at top law firms, investment banks, consulting firms to understand not only what do they do in their day-to-day, but what do they wish that an agent could help them do in their day-to-day? In law, for example, some of that might look like analyze this proposed contract amendment and understand if it's compatible with our hiring policies. Or we need to make a new hire, please analyze this proposed contract and make sure it's in line with past policies offered to current employees. Understanding these things that are what people really do and where models could be really useful is really important to making the benchmark, to Oz's point, something that's useful for labs to climb on, because it means nothing if agents can do A, B, and C tasks that aren't things that people do or aren't key to their workflows. Before we even started making tasks, we surveyed large pools of experts in these domains to understand where those gaps are to be more targeted.
Yeah, that's right. So we spoke to hundreds of experts from the Mercor platform. We asked them, what do they do in their current jobs? What do they wish that AI could do for them? And what kind of outputs they're creating from their work. So we use this to seed all of the tasks that we have in Apex Agents, and actually also all of the worlds.
The way that we talk about these benchmarks has changed significantly over time. Before, it was purely on this difficulty dimension, right? How hard is this actual task? And then now we're talking about this usefulness and economically valuable work dimension. So one question I have for all of you is, why is this dimension important, and how do you see the frontier of model improvement changing because of this newfound focus on economically valuable work?
So I think the main difference is that in the past, benchmarks would measure a very narrow concrete ability where you might give a lot of context in the prompt, and it just doesn't look like how a real person uses models. So you might have a huge 1,000-word prompt with a lot of instructions or all of these extra constraints. And it's great for measuring, can the model do the thing I ask it to when I give it a complicated scenario? But in the real world, someone comes in and they're like, I need a DCF, or is this contract good? Sometimes it gets more sophisticated than that. But in the real world, we have ambiguity. You have to look for files. You have prompts and usage patterns that just don't look like existing benchmarks. You're not giving them multiple choice output options in the prompt. You're assuming a lot more context. And I think we're going to move more and more towards things like this, where agents are expected to resolve a lot of ambiguity. They're expected to deal with the same amount of context to give to a coworker or, someone who reports to you. When you're just firing off like a one-line message, you fired off a few of them before. You want the agent to remember things. You want it to understand the full context that's not shared in the prompt.
And I think it's also that, as model performance has improved across the board, individual consumers expect a lot more out of the model and out of their interaction with the model. So it's no longer impressive or useful that models can summarize documents effectively. I think a lot of people, especially in professional use cases, kind of treat that as a given. And now it's like, okay, you can summarize the document or you can understand these documents, but can you update the LBO based on this new information? Can you take this summary of an employment contract and recommend the changes I need to make to be in compliance? So I think that where people start to use the products more and more, the bar that they have for what they can do is much higher.
I actually think that's one of the biggest things we found, that the production bar that people have is not like 75% accurate or 80% accurate. It's like 95, 99% accurate. People really want models to be able to do the task, do it completely, and not hallucinate or do anything wrong at the same time. And so the way we built the benchmark is so that when we evaluate model outputs, they actually have to get everything right to be awarded a pass benchmark.
One of the areas of focus in making these benchmarks as economically valuable as possible is, in this world building, so making that as realistic as possible. And the second thing is actually grading the agents and how well they accomplish these tasks. Yeah. So Bertie, one thing I'm curious about is, tell us a little bit more about the engineering and infrastructure work that went into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the design of the benchmark actually has 3 steps. So we start by creating worlds. There are 33 different worlds in the benchmark. Each world reflects a project scenario, a set of workers, typically 5 or 6 people, who will spend a week, maybe 50 to 100 hours over that week, building out a complete project. So all the data assets, all the research, all the PowerPoints and sheets and docs that you would make in a normal project, they will create all of that. Then step 2, we put this into RR Studio, or our studio. We have them create tasks and verifiers. And then the third step is that we can run the evaluations over that. So this is a very different design to typical benchmarks and evals, where you just have a single prompt and a single output.
Totally. And I imagine that as people think about Apex agents, one of the main things that's on their mind is, how can I reproduce this? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about what that looks like for an engineer or researcher who's interested.
Yeah, I mean, everything's open source. So the whole thing's open source. So all the data is open source, 480 tasks, all of the rubrics are open source, all of the worlds with all of their thousands of files and messages and documents are all open source. Everything has been checked. If you want to run this for yourself, it would only take half an hour to get up and running and to start seeing the results coming in.
Incredible. And I'm curious, where are we going to go from here, right? So Apex agents made a leap in both difficulty and this realism component. What's next on the horizon for model improvement?
Good question. So I think the things that we're most excited about in terms of next steps are, how do we make the tasks even longer? How do we let an agent run for days or weeks and make an environment that can simulate that week-long interaction with a human? Part of this is, how do we verify the outcomes of these really long tasks, right? It's really hard for a human to do that whole week-long process just to get one task. And then the other part is, how do we simulate coworkers? So in a week-long project, I might ask Abby for some documents I don't have. I might ask Bertie for something I don't have access to. I might just ask them for clarification questions. If we want to make an agent become a true virtual coworker, we need to start simulating the other coworkers it's going to lean on and create a whole simulated company that we can test models in.
These tasks may not even take a week. They might take a quarter or a year, right? Because humans have projects that take that long. One of the things I find interesting is also just that these worlds are sort of simulated and these tasks are also simulated. So how do you think about this real to sim gap and how to approach bridging it?
We think about the real to sim gap along every dimension of the Archipelago repo, the MCP servers that exist in it, the worlds, and the tasks. In terms of the worlds, They're realistic if they're made by real people doing valuable work. Everyone's workspace looks different. So here we care about the distribution of worlds that we have so we can measure model performance across any type of company. For tasks, we care about does this look like something that someone would do in the real world? Is this something my boss would ask of me? Is this something I would ask of a coworker? And then is the grading mechanism that we put in place actually grading a golden answer to be 100%? And failing it when it fails miserably or in any way that's not appropriate. The other big area is tools. We see a huge range of tools in the real world. Some of them are more reliable than others. Some of them have rate limits. Here we care about 2 dimensions. Can we mimic the same functionality that the top tools have? So all of the workspace suite, we want to really like maximize the compatibility, lower the symmetrical gap for those top power tools, and then get a breadth of tool behavior for the long tail, right? So we want to make a data set, make benchmarks, make training data that lets you deal with like the nth tool, right? So you've trained on 1,000, you get the 1,000 first. Have you generalized across the different ways that tools might be presented, documentation, reliability, etc.?
One of the notable aspects of these tools is that they often involve mock-ups of real software, and that software is often required to complete economically valuable work output. So what do you think will be the direction of these tools as we teach the agents to do more economically valuable work?
I think open source is the low-hanging fruit here. You can take the tool, you can containerize it, you can state manage it, you can run it offline. Super easy. But as you mentioned, a lot of the most valuable tools aren't open source. So we've got a number of options here. We try to take an open source tool and make it look like the real tool. We just go from scratch, try to recreate a real tool. We can try to work with the provider of that tool. That becomes really hard for a lot of these tools. So there's a breadth of options here, and the field is still exploring what's the most effective path forward. But what we're finding is that we want a variety of tools. A lot of people don't want to just memorize a few. The thought is if you train on maybe 100 open source tools, you're going to get some generalization to use that real black box tool. But it's still greenfield here, lots of things being tried. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because people sometimes ask me, like, what happens when we saturate the benchmark? What happens when they can do all these things perfectly? And I'm like, well, there'll be more tools. There'll be more things. The horizon will get longer. The tools will get higher fidelity, more complex, until basically you reach the point where your agent can do every form of economically valuable work that a human can do. You will always have more evals and more benchmarks that need to be created.
I totally agree with that, because if you look back, before the models could call any tools, we weren't even thinking about tool use, and we couldn't even support things like Apex. So I'd imagine as the models get more and more sophisticated and integrate with more and more tools, the horizon that these models can actually compete on and actually the frontier of things they can accomplish will only increase, which means more benchmarks. Maybe the last thing I'll ask all of you is, of course, it took many months to put together Apex agents and all of your hard work. So what's been your favorite part of working on the project, or your favorite kind of thing about Apex agents?
I think for me, by far, my favorite part has been working with the experts in these domains that have put together the worlds and tasks. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is getting to have this really granular understanding of what's important to them in their work. And so from the worlds to the tasks, we've gotten this picture of like, here's what work looks like. Here's what it looks like for a team of 5 consultants to work on an oil and gas cost-cutting analysis, and to go through step by step to see their communications with each other and their emails, their more informal communication in a chat, and all of their research and work products. So understanding really like, how do these workflows work and what's important for us to be measuring, and then working with them to understand some of their frustration with models and what models can't do and what they wish they could. I think that as we, build benchmarks and evals for labs to look at when they're thinking about where to train and where to focus training efforts, it's really interesting to get that sort of like personal connection to the model, where a lot of these people are really, really senior professionals in their firms and have some of the deepest experience in these fields in the world. And they have really personal connections to these tools where they're, I'm a power user of this model, or I use this model a lot, and like it does these things really well for me, but it's really frustrating that I can't do X or that I can't do Y. And we talk a lot about like the overall economic impact that Apex agents can have and that this kind of work can have. But I think also understanding the individual impact for, like one individual user of this model, how can this totally transform your workflow if we can get this handful of things right? It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think my favorite part was probably working with the team behind the benchmark and the repo, Abby, Birdie, and then a whole bunch of people who aren't in this video, and the iteration that we did over the data format and the delivery format. So it's really tough to get this simulation to look like the real world. There's a lot of moving parts, and then it's complicated by, can a customer even use this? Can a lab actually use the thing that we deliver to train their model, evaluate their model, and then train their model? And it requires a lot of iteration. It requires a lot of thought around every piece of the puzzle. How do the experts interact with our annotation tooling? How does this run in someone's training stack? And then what about the next person who has totally different requirements? And then how do we package this all up into an open source repo, Archipelago, that's still useful to researchers?
For me, it's been the reward modeling. I think the reward modeling and how do you grade agent outputs has been one of the hardest scientific questions that we've encountered. And I think actually the methodology we have now in the benchmark is fairly simple. So essentially each task has a rubric. The rubric has up to 10 criteria. So at least one criterion to 10 criteria. On average, I think it's 4. So it's not that many. And each one of those criteria tests a single part of the output. And they basically break it down. So they break down this fairly abstract idea of like a high quality output into these very discrete components. And then we say that all of them, the model has to get correct in order to be awarded a pass. And that's our grading methodologies. Then whether we're doing pass at 1, so we give the agent 1 attempt and see how it does, or pass at 8, where we give it 8 attempts and see if it gets 100% score at least once, it's always the same approach. And actually, in the end, I think this is the most rigorous and informative way of understanding agent performance.
So my favorite thing about Apex agents is just the number of pieces that have to come fit together for us to do this release. So thank you, Abby, Oz, Birdie, and the rest of the team for all of your efforts. Thank you so much to the experts for everything you did to make these worlds as realistic as possible. And let us know what you think. Hope you enjoy it as much as we do.